Chapter 4: Capital, Surplus Value, and Exploitation. Section 1: The Market Economy and Capital, the Transition from Money to Capital. In the first three chapters of Capital, Marx deals with the commodity and money, and it is explicit that capital does not yet enter the picture. This has led some authors to the understanding that these chapters depict, at a very high level of abstraction, a pre-capitalist society of simple commodity production, a mode of production in which commodity and money relations dominate, but with no or only a very underdeveloped capital. This notion presupposes that commodities are exchanged according to their labor values, because the producers are aware of the quantity of their own labor expenditure and that of their partners in exchange. The most prominent representative of this view was Friedrich Engels, who, a few years after Marx's death, formulated it in his appendix to the third volume of Capital, and therefore influenced many Marxists. But this idea is problematic in many respects. As a historical assertion, exchange has been practiced for thousands of years, and coin money has existed at least since 500 BC. But commodity and money relations in pre-capitalist eras were always embedded in other relations of production. They were never comprehensive, and the economy was not dominated by them. This is only the case with the spread of the capitalist mode of production. As a theoretical concept, it is precisely Marx's intent to show that the determination of exchange through value does not rest upon a conscious appraisal of the labor time expended, that those engaged in exchange do not know what they're doing, but rather their social cohesion is consummated behind their backs. As an explanation of the first three chapters of Capital, this misunderstands what it is that Marx depicts: simple commodity circulation. By this, Marx understands the circulation of commodity and money as a form of social interaction dominating the entire economy, but from a qualified and restricted viewpoint. Marx abstracts from the existence of capital. Marx is not analyzing pre-capitalist relations that existed at some time in the past, but rather capitalist contemporary conditions. The first sentence of Capital points this out, as emphasized above, while disregarding capital. That capital is disregarded is not an arbitrary whim of the theoretician, and it is also not a didactic consideration. A specific aspect of reality is expressed in the abstraction. Simple circulation appears as, quote, as that which is immediately present on the surface of bourgeois society, end quote. Grundrisse. The economy, for all intents and purposes, seems to consist only of acts of buying and selling. At first glance, the economy seems to fall into three large separate domains. 1. The sphere of production. At the respective level of technological possibility, goods are produced and services rendered. The sphere of circulation. Goods and services are exchanged, usually not directly, but for money. 3. The sphere of consumption. Goods and services are consumed either by individuals for the purpose of immediate survival, such as groceries, clothing, etc., or within the process of production as a means of production, such as machines or raw materials to make more products. In the process, the perception emerges that the sphere of consumption has solely to do with the needs of consumers, and the sphere of production with purely technical possibilities, so that only circulation remains as the actual sphere of economic activity. The reduction of the economy to the sphere of circulation has considerable consequences. The sphere of circulation is not only concerned with buying and selling, with transactions, therefore, in which, at least in principle, people face each other as free and equal partners, and in which, insofar as the commodities exchanged have the same value, nobody is fleeced, robbed, or exploited. If the people are in fact not so equal, because, for example, one person owns a lot and the other person owns very little, then that may be a regrettable circumstance, but does not count against the market economy. Disparities in ownership have no real theoretical relevance in the many liberal theories that sing the praises of the market economy. They appear to be extraneous to the process of buying and selling, and therefore to the market economy as, for example, the physical infirmities of the participants in exchange. From this perspective, the market appears as to be a neutral entity for the distribution of goods and the satisfaction of needs, as an efficient and completely non-bureaucratic institution for the transmission of information concerning what is needed, where, and in what quantity. According to this perspective, if the institution called the market does not function so well, this can only be the result of unfortunate marginal conditions or external disturbances that have to be removed by the state. Not only is such market euphoria presented as incontrovertible truths in almost every economics textbook, university economics department, and the business section of the large daily newspapers, after 1989, it was also adopted in different variations by many former leftists. The market and capital were sometimes even juxtaposed as downright opposing forces, and political conclusions drawn accordingly, whether in the form of the demand to curb the power of large corporations to help implement the beneficial effects of the market, or in the form of market socialism, in which capitalist businesses would be replaced by workers' cooperatives that would then briskly compete with one another on the market. So, whether the market and capital merely exist in an external, loose relationship, or whether there is an intrinsic necessary connection between the two, is therefore not merely an academic question. Rather, the answer has also direct political consequences. If the circulation of commodities and money depicted in the first 3 chapters of Capital is not something self-contained and independent of capital, as expressed by Marx in his use of the phrase surface to describe simple circulation, then this dependence must already make itself felt. Rather, similar to the relationship between the commodity and money, an intrinsic necessary connection between money and capital must be revealed. Let us shortly recapitulate the 3 essential steps in the course of depiction of the commodity and money. 1. The commodity was analyzed. It presented itself as having a twofold nature, as a use value and as value. The commodity's value objectivity turns out to be something special. It is a purely social characteristic which is not inherent in an individual commodity, but only exists as a common property of commodities that are exchanged, hence the spectral character of value. 2. For this spectral value to become tangible, it requires an independent manifestation. The spectral value obtains this tangibility in money. Money is therefore not supplemental to the world of commodities or a mere expedient. Money is necessary to express the value of commodities, to comprehensively relate commodities to one another as values. Hence the characterization of Marx's theory of value as, quote, a monetary theory of value. This also means that commodity production and money are inseparable. One cannot, as some socialists thought, abolish money while retaining private commodity production. 3. Money is an independent manifestation of value, but as the measure of values and as the means of circulation, money does not appear as such. Money serves here as a mere expedient. Only as a unity of the magnitude of value and means of circulation, money as money, does money become an independent manifestation of value. It is not only an intermediary that constantly disappears, in the case of the means of circulation, or that doesn't even have to be physically present, as in the case of the measure of values. It now becomes an end in itself, not just value, but the independent and constant manifestation of value. Money is to be retained and multiplied. However, as the case of hoarding shows, the independence and imperishability of money is limited. If money is withdrawn from circulation to be hoarded, it ultimately becomes a useless object. But if it is thrown into circulation, meaning if it is used to purchase commodities, the independent manifestation of value is lost. Within simple circulation, money is an independent and durable manifestation of value. But this independence and durability is nowhere to be seen. It cannot exist really at the level of simple circulation. If it is therefore correct that within simple circulation, the existence of commodities necessitates the existence of an independent expression of value, money, but this independence of value cannot exist within simple circulation. It thus follows that simple circulation cannot be something independent. Rather, simple circulation must exist as a moment within and result of an underlying process, namely the capitalist process of valorization, as will soon be shown. If money is in fact an independent and durable expression of value, then it must enter into the process of circulation. Money cannot exist separately, but at the same time, money cannot lose its independence and durability, as in the case with the act of the simple purchase, money purchasing commodities, with the subsequent consumption of the commodity. The independence and durability of value is only assured when money consummates the movement, money purchasing commodities to be sold for money. For this movement, the purchase of a commodity and the subsequent sale of this commodity for the identical sum of money does not yield any advantage. An advantage is only gained with the movement of money purchasing commodities that are sold for more money, where more money is greater than the initial money. In this movement, Marx describes it as the, quote, general formula for capital, end quote. Money not only retains its independent form, money also increases itself, so that it really does become the aim of the whole process. Only as capital does the independent form of value finally find its adequate and appropriate expression, or to put it another way, the permanent existence of value, encompassing the entire economy, is only possible when value executes the movement of capital. Money purchasing commodities to be sold for more money. The movement MCM prime, however, doesn't sound right. With the movement MCM prime, however, we leave the realm of simple circulation. Now we have to examine the substance and necessary conditions of this movement. The occult quality of value. Money, commodity, money prime. Did I say section 2? Falling apart here. Let's first take a look once again at the consequence of commodity, money, commodity, which commanded our attention in part 2.2 during the discussion of money's different functions. The commodity producer has produced commodity C with a particular use value. He sells this commodity and uses the money thus obtained to buy a different commodity with a different use value. The money is definitely spent. The aim of the process is the consumption of the second commodity. The measure of the whole process is set by the needs of the producers, and the process is included with the satisfaction of these needs. Now let's take a look at the consequence commodity, money, money, commodity, money. The sequence consists of the same elements, purchases of commodities and sales of commodities, as the sequence CMC. Only the order differs. Now a commodity is purchased in order to sell that commodity afterwards. Money is the starting point and end point of this process. Amounts of money can only differ from one another quantitatively, not qualitatively. The figure of circulation only yields an advantage if the amount of money at the end of the sequence is greater than the amount of money at the beginning of the sequence, when it is therefore a case of money, commodity, money prime, where money prime is greater than the initial money. Now, the point of the whole process is the quantitative increase of the original amount of money. The money is not spent, as it is in the case of commodity, money, commodity. Rather, the money is advanced. Money is given out only in order to take in a larger amount afterwards. A sum of value that performs this movement is capital. A mere sum of value in and of itself, whether in the form of money or a commodity, is not yet capital. A single act of exchange also does not make capital out of a particular sum of value. Only the linking of various exchange processes with the purpose of increasing the initial sum of value yields the typical movement of capital. Capital is not merely value, but rather self-valorizing value, meaning a sum of value that performs the movement money, commodity, money prime. The increase in value obtained from the movement of capital, the difference between money and money prime, is what Marx calls surplus value. In classical political economy and in modern economic theory, this concept surplus value does not exist. As we shall see later, surplus value is not merely a different name for profit or gains, but rather something different. However, at this time, there is no need to concern ourselves with the difference. On the exact meaning of profit, see Chapter 7. On the meaning of profit of enterprise, see Chapter 8. The only aim of the movement of capital is the increased sum of value that is initially advanced. But this purely quantitative increase knows neither measure. Why should a 10% increase be deemed insufficient while considering a 20% increase as sufficient? Nor limit. Why should the process end after a single movement or even 10 such movements? Unlike the simple commodity circulation of commodity, money, commodity, which has an aim outside the sphere of circulation, the acquisition of use values for the purpose of satisfying needs, and that finds its measure in the need and its limit in the satisfaction of that need, the movement of capital is an end in itself, unlimited and ceaseless. If one considers commodity production while abstracted from capital, one might get the idea that the aim of commodity production and exchange is the general satisfaction of need. Everyone satisfies his or her own needs by producing a commodity that satisfies the needs of others. This commodity is then exchanged for money in order to use this money to purchase a commodity that satisfies one's needs. Bourgeois economics, both classical political economy as well as modern neoclassical economic theory, understands commodity production in this way. Capitalist commodity production, the generalization of commodity production first occurs historically under capitalist conditions, is, however, not geared towards the satisfaction of needs, but to the valorization of value. The satisfaction of needs only occurs as a byproduct, insofar as it coincides with the valorization of capital. The aim of capitalist production is surplus value and not the satisfaction of needs. Up till now, we have spoken of capital, but not yet of capitalists. Someone who possesses a large sum of value is not yet a capitalist. Someone is only a capitalist when he or she actually disposes of this sum of value as capital, making the movement of capital as an end in itself a subjective aim. Quote, "It is only insofar as the appropriation of ever more wealth in the abstract is the sole motive behind his operations that the capitalist functions as a capitalist, i.e., as capital personified, endowed with consciousness and a will. Use values must therefore never be treated as the immediate aim of the capitalist, nor must the profit on any single transaction. His aim is rather the unceasing movement of profit making." End quote. Capital Volume 1, page 254. A person is therefore a capitalist only when he or she is capital personified, meaning that his or her activity follows the logic of capital, limitless and ceaseless valorization. For this it is not necessary that this person be the owner of capital. and only in this sense, capitalist as capital personified is the term capitalist used. Oh, excuse me. And only in this sense, capitalist as capital personified is the term capitalist used in the following chapters. Capitalists are, quote, personifications of economic relations, or, quote, economic character masks. This is similar to what we observe with regard to the activity of commodity owners. A person who behaves like a commodity owner or a capitalist insofar as his or her behavior follows a specific rationality. This rationality is a result of the form determinations of the economic process, the economic form determinations of the commodity or capital, respectively. As people's behavior conforms to this specific rationality, they reduce the preconditioned economic form determinant. In Marx's presentation, the economic form determinant must be analyzed first, before the behavior of people is addressed. An actual owner of money might pursue other goals besides the valorization of capital, but then he no longer operates exclusively as a capitalist. The fact that individual capitalists constantly attempt to increase his profit is not rooted in any psychological trait like greed. Rather, such behavior is compelled by the competitive struggle among capitalists. The individual capitalist, insofar as he or she wishes to remain a capitalist, requires increasing returns not to satisfy an increase in personal consumption, which in the case of large capital constitutes a tiny fraction of the total returns, but primarily to modernize production facilities or produce new products when there is no longer demand for older ones. If a capitalist foregoes modernization or change, he or she will soon be bankrupt. In section 5.2, in chapter 5.2, we will return to these coercive laws of competition. With the passage of time, the external form of appearance of the capitalist has undergone some changes. The free entrepreneur of the 19th century who managed his business and not uncommonly founded a family dynasty was largely replaced in the 20th century, at least in the larger businesses, by the manager, who often owned only a smaller share of stock in the business he managed. Both are capitalists in Marx's sense, that is, personifications of capital. They both dispose of a sum of value as capital. If the capitalist merely executes the logic of capital, then it is not he but rather capital, self-valorizing value, that is the subject of the process. Marx refers to capital in this regard as the, quote, automatic subject, a phrase that makes the paradox clear. On the one hand, capital is an automaton, something lifeless, but on the other, as the subject, it is the determining agent of the whole process. As the dominant subject in the process of valorization, value needs an independent form and obtains this independent form in money. Money is therefore the starting point and terminal point of the valorization process. Money was already the independent, if inadequate, form of value within the process of simple circulation. As capital, to repeat, capital is neither money nor commodity taken by itself, but rather the limitless and ceaseless movement of appreciation. Money purchasing commodities to be sold for more money. Value not only possesses an independent form, value is now a, quote, self-moving substance, which passes through a process of its own, end quote. A rather curious subject with extraordinary powers. Quote, in truth, however, value is here the subject of a process, in which, while constantly assuming the form and turn of money and commodities, capital changes its own magnitude. I misread that. In truth, however, value is here the subject of a process, in which, while constantly assuming the form and turn of money and commodities, it changes its own magnitude. By virtue of being value, it has acquired the occult quality to add value to itself. End quote. Capital Volume 1, page 255. It seems as if value is able to increase itself. Some banks use the advertising slogan, quote, "let your money work for you," which is characteristic of this illusion. Now let's examine what this occult quality rests upon. Sweater's coming off. Getting hot and heavy in here. (4.3) Class relations. The worker. Section 3. Class relations. The worker, free in the double sense. So far, we have only formally determined what capital is. A sum of value that valorizes itself, that executes the movement of money purchasing commodities to be sold for more money. But the question remains, how is this movement at all possible? Or to put it another way, where does surplus value come from? Within the sphere of circulation, valorization would only be possible if commodity C is purchased below its value or sold above its value. In this case, the sum of value advanced can be increased, but one capitalist gain is only possible if another capitalist takes a loss of the same amount. At the level of society as a whole, the sum of value is not changed. It has simply been redistributed, just as if a simple act of theft had occurred. Capitalist profit would therefore be explained as a violation of the laws of commodity production. If we assume the normal conditions of commodity production and circulation, then the, quote, exchange of equivalents applies. The commodities that are exchanged for one another have the same magnitude of value. The price paid is an adequate expression of the magnitude of value of the commodity and does not express a coincidentally greater or lesser magnitude. The commodities are exchanged, quote, at their true values, end quote. If surplus value is a normal phenomenon of capitalist commodity production and not just an exception, then its existence must be explained under the presupposition of a, quote, exchange of equivalents. And this is exactly the question that Marx poses. Marx's deliberation can be summarized as follows. If equivalent exchange is assumed, then surplus value cannot be constituted in circulation, not in the first act of circulation, money purchasing commodities, nor in the second act, commodities being sold for more money than the initial money. A change must take place between both acts, but outside of the sphere of circulation, the use value of the purchased commodity is merely consumed. Thus, the owner of money must find a commodity on the market whose use value possesses the quality of being a source of value, so that the use of this commodity creates value, and more value than the commodity itself costs. Such a special commodity exists. It is the commodity called labor power. The term labor power refers to the ability of humans to perform labor, and under the conditions of commodity production, the expenditure of labor can be a source of value. If I sell my labor power, then I relinquish this ability to someone else for a specific period of time. In the case of selling labor power, the entire person is not sold. I do not become a slave. But it is also not the case that labor is sold. Labor is the application of labor power. That only the ability to labor was sold, and not labor itself, is shown among other things by the situation where raw materials are temporarily missing and the owner of money cannot use the labor power he has purchased. That the owner of money encounters labor power as a commodity on the market is not a matter of course. Two conditions have to be satisfied for this to be the case. First, there must be people who act as free proprietors of their own labor power, who are therefore in a position to sell their labor power. A slave or a serf is therefore not in such a position, since the sellers of labor power must be legally free people. But if these people have means of production at their disposal and can produce and sell their own commodities or can subsist from production of their own labor, products of their own labor, then they will probably not sell their labor power. They are only driven to sell their labor power, and this is the second condition. If they do not own any means of production, if they are therefore not only legally free but also free of substantive property, then they actually treat their labor power as a commodity. The existence of workers who are free in this double sense is an indispensable social precondition of capitalist production. This is a specific relationship between social class, thus a specific relationship between social classes underlies the capitalist mode of production. On the one hand, there must exist a class of property owners, owners of money and means of production, and on the other hand, there must exist a class of largely propertyless but legally free workers. The relationship between social classes is usually what is meant when Marx speaks not of capital, but of the capital relation. When Marx deals with classes, he is doing so without developing a full class theory. The term refers simply to positions within the social process of production. In our case, to owners of means of production, and those who are excluded from this ownership, respectively. However, with regard to these classes defined by their social position, Marx does not assume that the individual members of a class automatically possess a common class consciousness or even that they exhibit a common class activity. At this depiction, class is in the first instance a purely structural category. Whether class means anything more has to be examined in each respective concrete context. When modern sociology, against Marx, claims to discover the end of class society within capitalism, then it usually cites as evidence the lack of class consciousness, or on the basis of possibilities for upward mobility or the individualization of society. It therefore makes use of a criteria that Marx does not at all apply to the structural concept of class predominant in capital. However, traditional worldview Marxism often drew the conclusion of a common consciousness arising from a structurally common social position and tended towards assuming a common social agency. Thus, instead of conceiving class rule as a structural relationship between social classes, it was conceived as an intentional relationship, where one class has imposed its will upon another class. The sheer existence of this class relationship, owners of money and means of production on the one hand, propertyless but legally free workers on the other, is in no way natural, but the result of a historical development. This historical development belongs to the prehistory of capitalism. In order to continue with the analysis of the fundamental structures of capital, it is sufficient to take the results of this prehistory as given. For that reason, the historical process of emergence of the worker as free in a double sense is sketched at the end of the first volume of Capital under the title, quote, so-called primitive accumulation. Using England as an example, Marx shows that this was an extremely violent and bloody process, which resulted in no way from the market, but was actively assisted by the state. We already hinted at this process in Chapter 1, Section 1, and Chapter 1, Section 2. However, primitive accumulation is not a historically singular process. In the course of the global spread of capitalism, similar developments occur. Section 4. The value of the commodity labor power, surplus value, and exploitation. To understand the emergence of surplus value, in spite of the exchange of equivalents, we have to concern ourselves in greater detail with the commodity called labor power. Like all other commodities, labor power has a use value and a value. The use value of labor power consists of labor power's application, that is to say, labor itself. Labor expenditure creates new value, which prior to the act of exchange can only be estimated. The extent to which labor expenditure was actually value constituting is revealed on the basis of the reduction that occurs in exchange. See Chapter 3, Section 3 above. Marx views the value of labor power as being, quote, determined, as in the case of every other commodity, by the labor time necessary for production and consequently also the reproduction of this special article, end quote. Every individual requires for his or her own maintenance a range of means of subsistence in the broadest sense, not just food, but also clothing, shelter, etc. Marx then concludes, quote, therefore the labor time necessary for the production of labor power is the same as that necessary for the production of those means of subsistence. In other words, the value of labor power is the value of the means of subsistence necessary for the maintenance of the labor power's owner. End quote. Capital Volume 1, page 274. Since the continued existence of the capital relation requires that labor power is continuously offered for sale in the market, the value of labor power must also cover the costs that are necessary for a worker's entire family, including the cost of education for the worker's offspring. If the traditional nuclear family, in which the male hires himself out as a wage laborer, while the woman takes over the reproductive labor, is socially predominant, the value of the male labor power has to cover the cost of reproduction. If, in contrast, the usual case is one in which two people are employed, this also influences the value of labor power. The cost of reproduction rise. Since a part of the reproductive labor no longer occurs in the household, and corresponding products and services have to instead be purchased or provided by the state, which in the latter case then have to be financed by higher taxes. The cost of reproduction for a family must no longer be covered by a single labor power, but by the sum of value of both labor powers. So the value of individual labor power, despite rising costs of production, will tend to sink. As with every commodity, price changes for the commodity labor power do not always express a change in value, but might also reflect the momentarily favorable or unfavorable situation for the sale of this commodity, a temporary scarcity or a temporary surplus of labor power. Actual change in value of labor power can result from two sources: from a change in the value of the means of subsistence necessary for the reproduction of the laborer, or from a change in the extent of the amount of means of subsistence necessary for the reproduction of the laborer. The extent of necessary means of subsistence differs among various countries and historical periods, and depends upon what is normally counted among the necessary requirements of life, as well as which claims workers are able to assert. Since it is not necessarily the case that capitalists willingly concede such claims, it is the class struggle between workers and capitalists that determines the value of labor power, as specific claims are imposed or not. In this context, Marx speaks of a, quote, historical and moral element, end quote, Capital Volume 1, page 275, that enters into the determination of labor power, which is not the case with other commodities. However, there is a further difference between the commodity of labor power and other commodities, which Marx does not address. The value of means of production used to produce a normal commodity forms part of its value, as well as the new value added by the labor that creates the finished product from these means of production. This is not the case with the commodity labor power. The commodity labor power's value is determined solely by the value of the means of subsistence that have to be purchased on the market. Reproductive labor carried out in the household, housework, child rearing, primarily by women, does not form part of the value of the labor power. Feminist authors have levied the accusation at Marx that the critique of political economy has a blind spot. For example, the programmatic essay by Claudia von Werthof. However, it is not Marx's determination of the value of the commodity labor power that is wrong. He gives an account of how its determination appears in capitalism. What is wrong is that he does not emphasize the distinctiveness of this determination of value, but instead attempts to prove its consistency with the determination of value of all other commodities. Within capitalism, the particular determination of the commodity of labor power is necessary. If workers would receive considerably more than the value of the means of subsistence they have to buy on the market, then they would in the long run no longer be without property and would be able to at least partially free themselves from the compulsion to sell their labor power. The restriction of the value of labor power to the cost of reproduction is a functional necessity of capitalism. But the achievement of this restriction is in no way a matter of course. It is entirely conceivable that a well-organized working class will be able to impose correspondingly high wages by means of labor struggles. How this restriction of the value of labor power is nonetheless imposed automatically in the course of capitalist production process of accumulation will be shown in section 6 of chapter 5. The difference between the daily value of labor power, the sum of value required on average by labor power for its own daily reproduction, and the new value that the individual worker is able to produce in one day under normal conditions, accounts exactly for the surplus value referred to above in the case of money purchasing commodities to be sold for more money. The fact that the daily value of labor power, the value required for labor power's own reproduction, is lower than the value can be created in a day by the use of labor power through the expenditure of labor power is the foundation of the quote occult quality of value to create value, new value. The daily value of labor power thus constitutes only a portion of the value newly created through the daily use of labor power. For example, if a particular sum of value is created through the expenditure of labor power during an 8-hour workday, then this newly created value can be formally divided into the value of labor power and the surplus value. If the daily value of labor power amounts to 3/8 of the value created over the course of an 8-hour workday, then one can formally state that the value of labor power was produced in 3 hours and the surplus value was produced in 5 hours. Marx therefore refers to the first 3 hours as necessary. Labor time required to produce the value of labor power, and the remaining 5 hours as surplus labor time performed by the worker beyond that necessary to reproduce his own labor power. Since the workers in our example receive the value produced in 3 hours as payment, Marx refers to the necessary labor time as paid labor, and the surplus labor time that the capitalist receives in the form of surplus value as unpaid labor. The fact that the individual worker receives a lesser value from the capitalist than the value he produced through his labor is referred to by Marx as exploitation, a term that can be misunderstood in various respects. The term exploitation is not meant to allude to especially low wages or especially bad working conditions. Exploitation refers solely and exclusively to the fact that the producers only receive a portion of the newly produced value that he or she creates, regardless of whether wages are high or low or working conditions good or bad. Exploitation, contrary to a widespread notion, and despite corresponding statements by many Marxists, is also not meant to be a moral category. The point is not that something is taken away from the workers that actually belongs to them, and that this act of taking is something morally reprehensible. The reference to paid and unpaid labor is also not intended to argue for the compensation of all the labor expended. On the contrary, Marx emphasizes that, according to the laws of commodity exchange, The seller of the commodity labor power receives exactly the value of his or her commodity. The fact that the buyer obtains a particular advantage from the use value of the commodity is no longer of any concern for the seller. Marx compares this to the example of an oil dealer. The dealer obtains the value of oil as payment, but does not receive in addition anything in addition for the use value of the oil. Exploitation and the existence of unpaid labor are not the results of an infringement of the laws of commodity exchange, but are rather in compliance with the laws of commodity exchange. If one wishes to abolish exploitation, then this cannot be accomplished through a reform of the relations of exchange within capitalism, but only through the abolition of capitalism. Section 5. The value of labor, an imaginary expression. Valorization rests upon the appropriation of unpaid labor time. The capitalist does not pay the value of the product created by workers, but pays the value of labor power. But according to everyday consciousness, wages are regarded as payment for the labor performed. Exploitation as the normal state of capitalist production is not visible. Exploitation only seems to occur if a wage is too low. It seems as if the wage does not express the value of labor power, but rather the value of labor. Marx refers to the term value of labor as an imaginary and irrational expression. Labor, more precisely abstract labor, is the substance and immanent measure of value. Labor creates value, but does not itself have value. If one speaks of the value of labor and asks how large the value of the working day of 8 hours is, then one would have to answer the 8-hour working day has a value of 8 hours of labor, a statement that Marx rightly describes as absurd. However, the phrase value of labor is not just an absurd expression. Marx maintains that, quote, imaginary expressions, like value of labor or value of land, quote, arise nevertheless from the relations of production themselves. They are categories in the form of appearances of essential relations, end quote. Capital Volume 1, page 677. The essential relation is the value of the commodity labor power, but it appears in the form of the wage as the value of labor. Such forms of appearance, quote, are reproduced directly and spontaneously as current modes of thought, end quote. Whereas the essential relations, quote, must first be discovered by science, end quote. Capital Volume 1, page 682. The value of labor is an inverted and incorrect conception, not brought about through conscious manipulation, but rather emerging from social relations. It is one of the, quote, objective forms of thought, Capital Volume 1, page 169, that structures the consciousness of people caught up within the conditions of capitalism. Why did I say that last word like that? Capitalism, not capitalism. From the viewpoint of the worker, an 8-hour day has to be fulfilled in order to obtain a particular wage amount. The wage seems to be the payment for this labor, an illusion further strengthened by the usual forms of wages. The, quote, time rate, payment according to hours of work, and the, quote, piece rate, payment according to the number of articles produced. In the former case of the time rate, it appears as if the labor performed during a particular unit of time is compensated. In the latter case of piece rate work, the labor performed for the production of a single article. Capitalists also succumb to this illusion. It is a spontaneously emerging inversion of reality to which all participants, as well as the majority of economists, submit. As the wage is understood as payment for the value of labor, all labor seems to be paid labor. Surplus labor, unpaid labor does not seem to exist. This inversion of reality has far-reaching consequences. all the notions of justice held by both worker and the capitalist. This inversion of reality has far-reaching consequences. Quote, all the notions of justice held by both worker and the capitalist, all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production, all capitalism's illusions about freedom, all the apologetic tricks of vulgar economics, have as their basis the form of appearance discussed above, which makes the actual relation invisible, and indeed presents to the eye the precise opposite of that relation. End quote. Capital Volume 1, page 680. The wage form constitutes the foundations of all further mystifications of the capital relation, which culminate in the Trinity formula. But at the present point, we must note that just as the spontaneous consciousness of all members of bourgeois society is subordinated to the fetish character of the commodity and money, both workers and capitalists are equally subordinate to the mystification of the wage form. The inversions generated by the capitalist mode of production do not stop at the doorstep of the ruling class. The insight of this class into social relations is therefore also limited. Nor does the ruled and exploited class enjoy a privileged position from which it is able to see through these inversions. The quote, standpoint of the working class, much vaunted by traditional Marxists, is of no further help here.